We'll finish the roofing in the final part of our garden pavilion build. Strapping made from 1x8s is then screwed to the top of the rafters. I spaced them about 8 inches apart and added an extra board at the top and bottom of the slope to cover the overhangs. I laid the boards out on sawhorses and rolled on a coat of stain on what would be the underside and edges. Even if you are used to being on roofs, it can get pretty tricky sometimes. You always have to watch your foot placement walking on rafters and strapping. The front roof rafters are 2x6 cedar. I cut them to length, trace the ellipse profile on one end, then lay them across the front beams to mark the bird's mouth. A horizontal seat cut and a vertical plumb cut. I use a block of wood that will mark the seat of the bird's mouth equal to the width of the beam. I clamped the rafter to a pair of sawhorses to make the cuts with my jigsaw. When they are done, I chamfer the edges with the power plane and angle grinder with the sanding disc. A quick single coat of stain is applied with a small roller. When dry, I take the rafters back up to the beams and attach with screws. Across these rafters, I attach 1x6 strapping. I had a few extras, so I spaced them a bit tighter. Trim is ripped down on the table saw and stained and screwed to the end rafters and across the front and back edge. Now to get the roofing installed on the front. Tar paper is rolled out over the front roof strapping and stapled into place. It was a bit finicky around the front post, so it took a bit longer to get that cut and stapled in place. The metal roof panels I ordered are 3 feet wide, so I needed to figure out how I was going to lay them out so the seams were in a good location and that cutting around the front post was as easy as possible. And I didn't want the last panel to be a thin strip that was not attached well, so that meant I needed to rip down the first panel before I cut the hole for the post. I have a metal cutting attachment that fits onto a drill. This tool makes cutting these panels a breeze. This first panel is laid in place and lined up with the edge of the roof. I use a Sharpie to mark the post and brace edges on the panel. Then back down to a sawhorse to cut out the shape. It was a bit too tight, so I had to trim off a bit, and I could do that up on the roof. Before I screwed the first panel down, I set the second panel in place and overlapped the first. I do this to check the alignment and to square the first two panels to my roof. I measure and mark the screw locations so I'll be consistent and evenly spaced across the entire front roof, and to be sure that all my screws hit wood underneath. I use 1-inch screws with rubber washers for this. The fourth panel ran into the far front post, so like the first, I marked its location and cut out the shape with snips. The last panel is ripped to length and a corner removed. The seam of the last two panels ran into the post, so they both needed cutting. The last panel was ripped a bit long so I could bend up the side to channel water away from the edge. I do this with a handheld folder. Cut off the excess. And fine-tune the bend with a hand seamer. I rolled out lengths of tar paper on the ground and cut them to the width of the main roof. It's easier to do this here than try to manage a full roll up on the roof. I line up the first piece along the bottom edge with a bit of overhang and stapled in place. Here's where I have to be careful not to step in the gap between strapping boards and rip my tar paper. I draw lines on a long 2x4 every 36 inches or so and use this as a marking guide for my panels. Then my screw holes are all in a line and hit the intended strapping board. This first panel is the guide for all the rest, so I always double check my position and alignment with the edge and peak of the roof before running in screws with my impact driver. I use the staple heads on the tar paper to guide my footing. These panels went up pretty fast. The last one needed a narrow strip trimmed off to make it fit. I had my roofing supplier bend up some rake and peak trim for me. I cut these to length and bend down a small tab on the lower edge before screwing them into place. On this edge, I pre-drilled the holes with a small bit to make it easier to set the screw in the right place. This was the edge where I bent up the roofing panel. A length of peak trim goes on the upper edge of the front roof. This piece is more for aesthetics than function, as there should be no rain hitting this edge of the roof. The trim comes in 10-foot lengths, so I have to piece sections together for coverage. On the main roof, I start at the bottom with a small piece of rake trim. Then overlap a longer strip and screw it into place through the side. To make the small tab, I cut out 2 sections of the trim with tin snips. Then bend the remaining section over with a hand seaming tool. One last side rake trim to do. Now the peak trim goes on. I bend a small tab on this piece, and it slips in under the side trim. Later, I'll add a small bead of caulking at this joint. The last piece overlaps and the tab slips in under the rake trim. And that's about it. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see on our channel, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe if you haven't done so already. We'll see you next time.